This is a story of poetic justice, where racism collides head-on with hidden power. It's a social drama that exposes systemic bias while delivering a satisfying moral reversal. The theme centers around abuse of authority, identity assumptions, and unexpected empowerment. It explores how individuals in positions of privilege often judge others based on appearances, until they're forced to face the consequences of their ignorance. At the heart of this story lies a powerful theme of injustice being exposed. The antagonist, a white police officer who misuses his authority, makes the critical error of targeting a black woman solely based on racial prejudice. What he doesn't realize is that his target isn't just a random citizen. She's married to the most powerful political figure in the city. What begins as a routine traffic stop escalates into a full-blown scandal that threatens the officer's career, reputation, and freedom. This story falls under the genre of contemporary social drama, with strong elements of thriller and emotional confrontation. The tension builds through real-world conflict, racism, social hierarchy, and the abuse of institutional power. It also features a legal and political undercurrent, as the truth behind the characters' identities is slowly revealed. There are brief beats of suspense, especially when the protagonist remains composed while the officer grows increasingly aggressive, making the reader wonder how far the injustice will go before the tables turn. The story is driven primarily by suspense and moral outrage, followed by a profound sense of vindication. The reader is meant to feel anger and discomfort during the harassment scene, and then experience deep satisfaction when the truth unravels. By the end, there's a strong emotional release, a feeling that justice, for once, was served in an unforgiving system. This emotional arc is crucial, from fear to helplessness to empowerment. It reflects the real emotional journeys faced by many marginalized individuals who suffer injustice but lack the means or position to retaliate, except in rare moments like this. Racist cop Harasses black driver. Then his badge meets power, is direct and powerful. It evokes outrage, curiosity, and intrigue. It also sets up an immediate question in the reader's mind. What happened when the cop found out? That curiosity drives the reader forward, while the implied twist promises satisfaction and justice. The phrasing also highlights the irony of the situation. How someone who wields power arbitrarily is suddenly forced to face a higher power they didn't anticipate. The lights flashed behind her like a warning she'd seen too many times before. Red, blue, red, blue. She sighed, easing her luxury sedan to the curb with a calm precision that hid the storm inside her chest. The officer's voice crackled through the patrol car's speaker. License and registration. Hands on the wheel where I can see them. No greeting. No explanation. Her knuckles tightened on the leather steering wheel. Her eyes flicked to the mirror. She could see him swaggering toward her. White, tall, maybe in his 30s, his face already twisted in that smug, superior look she knew too well. Of course, she murmured, her voice measured, careful. He leaned into her open window before she could even retrieve her documents. Whose car is this? His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. She looked up at him slowly, deliberately. Mine. He snorted. You expect me to believe that? There it was. The question behind the question. How could a black woman afford this kind of car, this kind of life, without it being stolen, borrowed, or bought with dirty money? She remained composed. Is there a reason I'm being pulled over, officer? He smiled. But it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile wolves give sheep just before they pounce. We'll get to that. Step out of the vehicle. She blinked. Excuse me. You heard me. He unlatched his holster, not drawing, but letting her see that he could. Out. Now. There was a beat of silence. The wind rustled the leaves lining the quiet suburban road. A jogger slowed across the street, watching curiously. She exhaled slowly, unbuckling her seatbelt. I'm not resisting. I'm stepping out as instructed. He backed away slightly as she opened the door and stood tall in her heels and suit. A dark navy power suit that whispered authority even louder than she could. Turn around. Hands on the car. Officer. Now. The sharpness in his voice turned heads. Another car slowed. A woman inside lifted her phone, recording. The black woman complied. Her face neutral, but her eyes burning. As his hands began to frisk her, roughly and without a word of consent, she said quietly, You're making a very serious mistake." He laughed. "Oh yeah? What? Are you going to call your lawyer?" "No," she said calmly. "My husband will." "And what's he going to do exactly?" She turned her head slowly, her voice clear and deliberate. "He's the mayor." Silence. For a long second, nothing moved. Not the leaves, not the cars, not the breath in the officer's chest. He stepped back slightly, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What did you say?" "I said," she repeated, "he's the mayor. And you just unlawfully detained his wife." The jogger stopped now, filming outright. Another car pulled over. Someone yelled, "Hey, what's going on?" The officer looked around, his grip on control, on power, slipping through his fingers like dry sand. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. Because this wasn't just about one cop and one traffic stop. It was about every moment before this. Every microaggression, every humiliation, every injustice shoved down and smiled through. And now? Now the game had changed. Her name was Danielle Cartwright, 42 years old, former civil rights attorney turned social impact strategist, community organizer, and, as of the past 3 years, the First Lady of Brookhaven City. But none of that had mattered when the red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Because before any title or position, she was black. And in America, that still came first. Danielle grew up in the south side of Chicago, daughter to a public school teacher and a sanitation worker. Her parents worked double shifts and made double sacrifices, hoping their little girl would one day sit in rooms they were never allowed to enter. And she did. Harvard Law, federal clerkship, landmark police misconduct case victories. A voice that couldn't be silenced until she chose, finally, to stop shouting into courtrooms and start building something bigger. That's when she met Marcus Wright. He was an alderman then. Tall, brilliant, relentlessly honest. Their fire matched, and so did their frustration. They didn't just want change, they wanted to embody it. When Marcus announced his candidacy for mayor, it was Danielle who built his campaign from the ground up. She trained volunteers, hosted strategy dinners, and answered midnight phone calls about policy reform and housing justice. She wasn't just the wife behind the man. She was the engine that got him elected. And yet, here she was, frisked, pulled out of her own vehicle like a criminal, by a man who couldn't see past his own bias long enough to recognize the woman who had once stood on the city courthouse steps, hand in hand with the mayor, promising justice for all. Danielle's strength wasn't just in what she had done. It was in what she carried and what she survived. The burn scars from an activist protest when police used tear gas on peaceful marchers. The time she was mistaken for a paralegal in her own courtroom. The countless compliments about how articulate she was. And now this. The ironic thing? She wasn't afraid. Not of the officer. Not of his weapon. Not even of the consequences. What she feared, what always weighed on her, day and night, was the illusion that progress had made them safe. Safe from profiling. Safe from dehumanization. Safe from the quiet violence that didn't come with bullets, but with assumptions. Even now, as the wind brushed her braids across her cheek and the officer's confusion grew, she stood anchored in her own poise. She had taught herself this since she was 15. You do not cry. You do not yell. You outthink them. You outlast them. And she would. She felt the buzz of her smartwatch on her wrist. Marcus, probably calling again after she'd missed his last 2 texts. He always worried when she was out too long. A habit born not of insecurity, but of lived reality. She wondered how fast this story would hit the city hall steps. How long it would take for this officer to realize that his actions hadn't just crossed a line. They'd crossed the First Lady of the city. But for Danielle, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about reckoning. Because if this could happen to her, with her name, her title, her influence, then what about the ones with none of that? What about the girls still walking the same streets she grew up on, hoping the world would see them? Would it? She took in her surroundings now, the car still idling, the cameras recording, the small but growing crowd. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It was a moment, a flashpoint, and Danielle knew how to seize it. She always did. Do you have any weapons or illegal substances in the vehicle? Officer Braxton barked, hand resting dangerously on the butt of his firearm. Danielle didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't even blink. No, she answered with quiet, deliberate clarity. I'm unarmed, and I'd like to know the reason for this stop. You failed to signal at the last intersection. He snapped back, eyes skimming everything but her face. License and registration. That was a lie. She'd signaled. She always did. Still, she reached calmly into her glove compartment, slowly, precisely, narrating every move like a public safety video. She handed over her documents and watched his eyes narrow, squinting at her name. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps? Or irritation. Danielle knew that name carried weight in this city. But Braxton didn't make the connection. Not yet. Or if he did, he didn't care. Step out of the vehicle, he ordered. Her breath caught. That wasn't procedure. Not for a failed signal. Not unless. Excuse me, she asked. I said step out. Now. People were watching now. 3 onlookers with phones out. A city bus had slowed down across the intersection. The driver, a middle-aged black man, stared intently. The neighborhood Danielle had grown up in, the neighborhood she still served, was bearing witness. She stepped out, hands visible, posture straight, dignity intact. Braxton looked her over like she was something to be dissected, not understood. Put your hands on the hood. She did. The metal was cold. The kind of cold that went straight to your bones and reminded you, this is what powerlessness feels like. And then came the pat-down. Her jacket was brushed back. Her waistline checked. Her legs stiffened as he moved down without a word. A violation veiled in protocol. She clenched her jaw and stared forward, eyes fixed on the cracked sidewalk ahead. Someone shouted, "That's the mayor's wife." "Hey, what are you doing?" Braxton paused, a slight hesitation in his motion. Danielle felt it. "What did they say?" he asked over his shoulder. "You heard me, man," came the voice again. "That's Danielle Cartwright. She's married to Mayor Wright." Another phone lifted into view. Another recording started. Suddenly, the air felt electric. Braxton's jaw tightened. He stepped back. Danielle slowly turned to face him. Now she looked directly at him, into him. "Officer," she said softly, "do you realize who I am?" He didn't answer. "I'm the first lady of this city, and I've been unlawfully searched, detained, and humiliated on my own street." Now he blinked. The storm came in his silence. His confidence cracked like cheap plaster. He stepped back again, eyes darting to the gathering crowd. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 417. I have a situation." The dispatcher crackled back, loud enough for Danielle to hear. "Go ahead, for 17. Braxton lowered his voice, turned slightly away from her, but it was too late. Danielle's phone was in her hand now, already recording. "I suggest you put that down," Braxton said, not as commanding now, almost pleading. "I suggest you get your supervisor on the scene," she replied. The moment stretched out like a pulled rubber band. Everyone watching knew it was about to snap. Sirens approached, not aggressive this time. Controlled. An unmarked city patrol SUV pulled up behind Braxton's cruiser. Out stepped Captain Elaine Morris, head of internal affairs, and one of the very few people in the department Danielle trusted. Her heels clicked sharply against the asphalt. "Danielle?" she asked, voice tight with concern. Danielle turned, face still composed, but fury simmering behind her eyes. "Yes, I was pulled over, searched without cause, and handled like a criminal for failing to signal. Something I did, by the way." Elaine nodded, eyes already scanning the patrol car, the body cam, the phones held up by the onlookers. "Braxton," she snapped, "turn over your footage. Now." He hesitated. "That's an order." Danielle folded her arms. The crowd was dead silent. This was no longer a traffic stop. This was a reckoning. Elaine approached Danielle. "Do you want to file charges?" "Not yet," Danielle replied. "But I expect a formal apology. In front of the media. And I want this officer suspended pending a full investigation." Elaine nodded. "Consider it done." Braxton stood frozen, his entire career unraveling in real time. His power, his badge, his arrogance, all now on the floor, shattered. Danielle leaned forward slightly and spoke so only he could hear. "This isn't just about me. This is about every woman like me who didn't have a title to protect her. You picked the wrong one today." With that, she walked calmly back to her vehicle. The engine still hummed softly. The crowd erupted into claps, a few shouts of "That's right," and "Justice." She got in, closed the door gently, and took a deep breath. It had started as a routine drive home. Now the city would know what happened when you profiled the mayor's wife. And she was just getting started. Danielle didn't go home that night. Not because she was afraid, but because something inside her had ignited. Something long buried, something fierce. After the incident, she drove to City Hall. It was after hours. The building loomed in silence, its glass facade reflecting the glowing skyline. But Danielle had keys. She always did. Being the mayor's wife came with privileges, but tonight, she wasn't wearing that title as armor. She was wearing it as a weapon. She made her way through the marble halls to her husband's office. The city seal gleamed on the wall behind his desk, golden and indifferent. She stared at it for a long time, thinking. The past few years had taught her how politics operated, how power looked polished on the outside, but was often corroded within. What had happened today wasn't new. Not for people who looked like her. Not for people who walked with dignity, but were greeted with suspicion. What made this different was that now, she had proof. Witnesses. Footage. Authority. She had a story that could ripple far beyond her own experience. And she was done waiting for someone else to fix it. The door creaked behind her. Mayor Isaac Wright stepped in, tie loosened, eyes weary. "I heard," he said softly. Danielle turned to him. "How fast?" "Before you finish the pat-down," he replied. Twitter blew up. A bus driver posted the video. Then a teacher. Then some kid who live-streamed the whole thing. The press is outside the precinct already. She nodded slowly, her mind still racing. "And what are you going to do about it?" Isaac sighed and approached her. "I already suspended Braxton. Internal Affairs is launching an immediate inquiry. We'll issue a public statement tomorrow morning." "That's not enough," she said. He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want this entire system reevaluated. Every complaint reviewed. Every stop investigated. I want bias training overhauled. Body cam footage audited monthly. I want an independent civilian board overseeing misconduct. And I want it now, not in a year, not in 5 months, now." Isaac rubbed his forehead. "Danny, I agree with you. But these things take time." "No," she said, voice sharp. "What takes time is healing from humiliation. What takes time is earning back the trust of people who've been hurt by the badge that's supposed to protect them. Fixing this starts immediately." There was a pause. Then he smiled softly, not with amusement, but with admiration. "You know," he said, "when I met you, I knew you'd change things. I just didn't realize I'd be standing in your way someday." "You're not," she said, "unless you choose to be." By morning, Danielle was all over the news. Mayor's wife illegally detained, demands full reform. Danielle Cartwright, from educator to advocate. Is this the moment that changes policing in our city? And while Isaac held a press conference to announce immediate suspensions, review boards, and public transparency mandates, Danielle wasn't by his side. She was in the community. She stood outside the very precinct that had profiled her and spoke through a megaphone to a crowd that had tripled in size by midday. "This isn't about my name," she said. "This is about yours. Your father's. Your sister's. Your son's. This is about every single time someone in uniform forgot the humanity of the person in front of them." Applause erupted. "I am not here for revenge," she continued. "I am here for restoration. I want justice, yes, but more than that, I want transformation." A man in the crowd shouted, "Run for office." She smiled but shook her head. "Power is not in a title. It's in the people. And I am here to make sure every voice is heard. Loudly, clearly, unapologetically." She held up the phone that recorded the incident. "This is what changed everything. Not just my title. Not just my husband. This. The truth. We don't need special connections. We need accountability. Transparency. Dignity." Later that week, Danielle launched a platform, the Truth Project. Its mission was simple: collect real stories of racial bias and public misconduct from across the city. Every voice mattered. Every file would be reviewed. Legal teams would be assembled. Policy advisors recruited. Activists invited to speak. It wasn't just a platform. It was a movement. By month's end, city council members were calling her. Civil rights organizations were asking for partnerships. Universities were requesting lectures. Black mothers were emailing her stories, some painful, some hopeful, all powerful. One message read, "I used to think no one would ever believe me. Then you stood up. And now I feel like I matter." Danielle read that one over and over. It became her mantra. Of course, there were those who pushed back. Local police unions accused her of inciting public distrust. Conservative pundits labeled her angry and ungrateful. Anonymous threats began to show up in her inbox. But Danielle stood firm. She knew how movements were made. not by staying safe, but by stepping forward. She visited youth detention centers, met with reform committees, hosted panels on justice. And every time someone doubted her, she reminded them, I didn't choose this journey. It chose me. And now, I walk it, for all of us. One evening, at a town hall meeting packed with over 500 residents, she took the podium again. My name is Danielle Cartwright. I was profiled, searched, and humiliated. But I will not be silenced. Because this is the beginning of something bigger than me. The crowd rose to their feet. Cheers echoed through the halls. Danielle smiled, not out of pride, but from deep knowing. The journey had begun, and she wasn't walking it alone. The city had never seen a protest like this. It wasn't just the size, it was the energy. It wasn't just the chants, it was the clarity of purpose. What began as outrage over one woman's mistreatment had become a full-blown reckoning. Thousands poured into the downtown streets, carrying signs, lifting each other's voices, and demanding change not just in policy, but in perception. At the heart of it stood Danielle. Her face no longer just the wife of the mayor, but a symbol of accountability. A catalyst. A mirror held up to a system that had too long gone unchecked. On the city's largest stage, Freedom Plaza, she stepped up to a podium constructed hastily by organizers. Behind her stood activists, lawyers, city workers, students, and survivors. Around her were camera crews, media vans, and swarms of drones buzzing overhead. But in front of her was the people. And she began. You know my name now? But months ago, I was just a woman doing her grocery shopping. I didn't have a spotlight. I wasn't trending. I was just black. And that was enough to be treated like a threat. The crowd grew quiet, hanging on every syllable. When Officer Braxton grabbed me, he wasn't just rough with his hands. He was rough with his judgment, with his assumptions, with his belief that my appearance told him all he needed to know about my worth. Danielle took a deep breath. But what he didn't know was that I was not alone, that none of us are. What he didn't know was that one act of injustice would awaken 1,000 voices that had been silenced for too long. Applause erupted, followed by chants of no more silence. No more silence. Danielle raised her hand, quieting the crowd. I am not here to be your savior. I'm not a hero. I'm a reminder, she said. A reminder of every time you were followed in a store. A reminder of every time your resume was overlooked. A reminder of every time your name alone closed a door. Her voice sharpened. But we are not begging to be seen anymore. We are demanding transformation. The crowd roared. As she continued, she unveiled her campaign. The People's Platform, a full legislative agenda rooted in justice reform, economic equity, educational access, and restorative accountability for law enforcement. Crafted by community voices, co-authored by experts, endorsed by leaders. It wasn't just words on paper. It was a battle plan for rebuilding trust. And it was time to act. 2 days later, Danielle stood in city council chambers, flanked by legal representatives, community elders, and dozens of impacted citizens. The mayor had relinquished the floor to her, publicly and symbolically. As she addressed the council, the atmosphere was tense. Not all members were allies. Some looked skeptical. A few stared with thinly veiled contempt. But Danielle didn't flinch. This isn't a plea. This is pressure, she said. We're not asking you to care. We're showing you that we're already moving, with or without you. She laid out her data, testimonies, legal precedent, the cost of inaction, not just financial, but moral. Your choice is not between action or peace. Your choice is between action or continued unrest. After her speech, silence hung in the air. Then came the first yes, then another, then one more. Within an hour, the council had passed 4 emergency reform measures, including mandatory de-escalation and racial bias training with community oversight, an independent civilian review board with subpoena power, full public access to police stop-and-search data, funding for mental health responders to be deployed in nonviolent situations. And with that, history was made. But the real climax came not in chambers or in the streets, but at the place where it all began, the precinct. Danielle returned to the exact sidewalk where she had been detained. But this time, she wasn't carrying groceries. She was carrying justice. With her were dozens of community members. A new mural had been painted across the station wall. Danielle's silhouette surrounded by faces of black men and women, old and young, with the words, We will not be profiled into silence. She stood beneath it, tears forming as a young girl walked up and held her hand. Are you the lady they hurt? The girl asked. Danielle kneeled. Yes, baby. But I healed. And now I help others heal. The girl nodded. I want to be like you. Danielle hugged her tightly. Be braver. Be louder. Be unstoppable, she whispered. That evening, the city held a vigil. Candles lit up the park like constellations. Names were read. Stories shared. Songs lifted. Danielle stood alone at the microphone one last time that night. I was stopped because they saw a threat. But the real threat was truth. And truth always finds a way out. She looked out at the sea of glowing lights. Tonight, we remember. Tomorrow, we rebuild. Months passed. The city hadn't just changed on the surface. It had begun to transform at its roots. The streets that once felt cold and hostile to Danielle now carried whispers of her courage. Murals, newspaper columns, school assemblies, all echoing the story of the woman who was once humiliated, but rose like fire through silence. Danielle walked those same streets again, not as the mayor's wife, not even as the woman from the viral video. She walked as herself, whole, unshaken, and deeply grounded in purpose. She passed children riding bikes who waved at her, teenagers nodding with admiration, and elders offering her quiet blessings. Some would say she had become a celebrity, but fame had never been the goal. Empowerment was. Healing was. Restoration was. One afternoon, while visiting a youth center that had just been renamed in her honor, Danielle was approached by a young boy, maybe 12 or 13, with big eyes and hesitant steps. Ms. Danielle, he said shyly, can I ask you something? She knelt down to his level. Of course. He bit his lip. Were you scared when they grabbed you? Danielle paused. The truth would serve him more than a polished answer. Yes, she nodded. I was very scared. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if I would get home that day. But I also knew something else. What? He whispered. That fear wasn't mine to carry. That fear belonged to the system. Because it knew it was wrong. It knew its time was running out. The boy smiled. Did it work? He asked. She looked around. At the community garden, now thriving across the street. At the security guard in the building who'd been hired through a new equity program. At the mural behind them that read, Power doesn't protect truth. Truth creates power. She smiled back. Yes, it's still working. Later that evening, Danielle and her husband Michael sat together on their back porch. The air smelled of jasmine and wet soil. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were still. He held her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. You changed everything, he said. No, she replied softly. We did. He shook his head. No, I was part of the system. You held up a mirror to it. You made it impossible to look away. She rested her head on his shoulder. I didn't want this not like that. But maybe it had to happen. Maybe that moment, ugly and raw as it was the universe cracking something open. They sat in silence. Do you forgive me? He asked. Danielle looked at him, really looked. I forgive the man who forgot who I was. But I'll always love the man who remembered. A tear slipped down Michael's cheek. Not about the scandal or the politics, but about resilience, identity, and the sacred rage that births revolutions. She called it walked in with dignity. She started speaking at schools, shelters, and prisons, anywhere her story could inspire. But more importantly, she began listening. Listening to people who had no cameras, no allies in high places, no viral moment to rescue them. She knew the fight wasn't over. It may never be. But every time she heard a voice crack open with truth, every time she saw someone stand a little taller because they had seen her do it first, she knew the healing had begun. And perhaps the most emotional moment of all came not on stage or in City Hall, but in her own mirror. One morning, Danielle stood looking at her reflection. She saw the woman who had once questioned her worth. She saw the woman who had once been dragged, doubted, dismissed. But most of all, she saw the woman who refused to stay silent. She whispered to herself, You were never just one voice. You were the echo of so many others. A tear slid down her cheek, but it wasn't from pain. It was from freedom. In the end, it wasn't just about racism, or injustice, or power. It was about truth. Danielle's story reminded the world that truth doesn't beg to be seen, it demands it. And when truth finally rises, no uniform, no badge, no title can silence it. The viral moment may fade. The headlines may get buried. But the impact lives on. In every policy changed, every heart awakened, every voice that now dares to speak. Because that day wasn't an accident. It was a mirror, and everyone watching saw themselves in it, either in the driver's seat, the uniform, the silence, or the crowd. That moment asked a single, piercing question. Where do you stand? Danielle's journey shows us that no position is too powerful to be held accountable. No victim is too voiceless to start a revolution. And no wound is too deep to heal. The mayor's wife was harassed, but it was never about titles. It was about dignity. And now? Now, cities remember her name. Laws carry her imprint. And young girls of color walk with a little more fire in their stride, because they know, if they ever find themselves in a moment like Danielle's, the world just might be watching. And this time, they'll listen.